This activity 5 is going to go in much of the same way as the activity that you just completed, except we're going to focus on priming this activity and look at a lot of different examples and demonstrations for priming, and also some different types of priming that your text didn't really get a chance to touch upon. And so why is it that even when people experience the same exact sensory information, their perceptions and interpretations of that information can be completely different? And so this is a common example that went viral on the internet a few years ago. This is the same exact dress. Really, this has to do with contrast and how it affects how the visual perception affects people, but the idea is that it was the same exact light and sensory information. And so this is rather an extreme example that has the help of some contrasting tools online, but we'll look at some more laboratory-based examples of priming and how we can prime perception and memory. And so the general idea of priming is that the activation of some information affects how other information is processed. And so you can really look at this as the effect of context. So it could be that some sensory information that's coming in affects how other sensory information is processed. So what you're seeing affects what you're hearing, for instance, or it could be that what is already activated in your working memory or the information that you know in your long-term memory affects the information that you perceive or the information that you remember. So it's all about context. Might make a little bit more sense once we get into some actual examples. And so we're going to look at perceptual priming and the priming of attention and memory, which you could also consider conceptual priming. So this is the expanded information processing model that we have been slowly building upon both this week and last week. And so what we're going to first look at is perceptual priming. So how the context of what's going on can affect how our brain actually puts together sensory information and subsequently the reality that we end up perceiving. So often the incoming visual information can prime how you perceive auditory information. And so this always happens that what you see affects what you hear. It's not often that what you hear affects what you see, and that's because, as we just learned in the previous activity, iconic sensory memory is much faster and much briefer than echoic. So if you remember, iconic is about 100 milliseconds, and echoic sensory memory would last up to 4 seconds. And so this really quick visual sensory information can affect what you end up hearing. So there's a pretty famous example that we'll look at briefly on a YouTube video for demonstration.
Bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case. Have a look at this. What do you hear? But look what happens when we change the picture. And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B. It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect. Take another look. Concentrate first on the right of the screen. Now to the left of the screen. The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So the mouth movements we see as we look at a face can actually influence what we believe we're hearing. If we close our eyes, we actually hear the sound as it is. If we open our eyes, we actually see how the mouth movements can influence what we're hearing. Ba, ba, ba.
It's a bizarre effect. Remember, the only sound you're hearing is ba with a B.
Ba, 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 ba.
What's remarkable about this illusion is even knowing how it's done doesn't seem to make a difference.
Ba. The effect.
So I'm going to skip the rest of this video and we'll just jump right to the chase. This is the perfect example of how we talked about last week, that your perception is how your brain puts together various sensory information and creates an interpretation of it, a best guess, if you will, of what actual reality is here. And so since we process this iconic sensory information so much faster, our perception is relying heavily on that, and it's actually skewing and giving us an inaccurate or a misperception of the auditory information. We can see a similar effect if we look at the effect of visual sensory information, so information from iconic sensory memory, how that can affect your perception of tactile sensations or pain. So we're going to watch another short video here.
Hi. I'm Larry.
Hi.
Very nice to meet you, Edie. We're going to do a little demonstration here called the rubber hand illusion. It's going to be a little
This illusion may look like fairground fun, but it reveals one of the most important new
You want to
ideas
put your other hand out? Thank you. Right there. Good. And can you put this hand down right over here and just curl it up like the rubber hand's curled up a little bit? All right. Now, what I'm going to do is try to position the rubber hand so it looks like it's your own. Okay, could you imagine that being your own hand, kind of? Yeah. What we're going to do is we're going to stroke your fingers simultaneously, the rubber finger and your real finger, and hopefully this will convince you that the rubber hand is your own, that your brain will actually adopt this hand.
In the illusion, simply watching the rubber hand being stroked at the same time as the real hand is enough to trick the brain into adopting it as its own.
We like weird. And slowly but surely, you should feel that the hand you're looking at is actually part of your body.
So it's like you're touching my hand with that one.
Right, so it feels like this is your hand that I'm touching, right?
Yeah.
You okay?
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop there and skip to the chase again. This is actually a very interesting demonstration of how perception is put together and as an interpretation or best guess. And you can actually do this one at home. And so the idea is that they are stroking both a hand, dummy hand that looks just like your hand. At the same time, they're stroking your actual hand, but you are looking at the dummy hand. Eventually, they stop stroking your actual hand and only stroke the dummy hand. And as you look at it, you still feel the sensation of your hand being stroked, even though it's the dummy hand. And then, of course, at the end, they startle everyone by pounding or creating some injury to the dummy hand. And that always startles people because they're perceiving that as their real hand. And often people actually feel some amount of pain when they do that because your perception is thinking that that visual information from the dummy hand is your hand. And so this concept explains various other somatic symptoms and also things like phantom limb syndrome, where people have had amputated limbs and still perceive pain in that limb, even though it clearly doesn't exist. And so again, even knowing what this is supposed to do doesn't help prevent your perception from making these types of errors. And so we can see that the context of what's going on while you're perceiving things can affect what you're actually perceiving. But if there is no context to help fill in the blanks for things or that might not be there, your perception will actually use your long-term memories and what you already know to fill in the blanks. And so a lot of times you will perceive what you are expecting, even if that sensory information isn't actually there. So let's look at this quick GIF that we have online. And so the question is, what do you hear when you watch this GIF? About a third of people actually hear some type of thudding or thumping noise. And this is because your perception is putting together the shaking of the camera, which in previous experience might indicate some type of large object hitting the ground. It's also pulling in prior knowledge that you know about jump roping and things of this nature. And so your perception is using what you know from prior knowledge, aka what you would expect, to fill in the blanks. So even though there is no sound, oftentimes people do. I'll be honest, I don't hear a thudding here, but research shows that about a quarter to a third of the people do. So we always use our prior knowledge to fill in the blanks for perception, or sometimes we use the context of other sensory information that's going on. But we especially use our prior knowledge and what we expect when we're interpreting possibly ambiguous information. And so a lot of the time when we're perceiving auditory information, we might actually hear things wrong, especially if we don't have any visual cues like lips, like we saw in that first cue. And so one good example of priming in this sense is to give someone a piece of somewhat ambiguous information. It can either be visual or auditory, and to prime them with some related information beforehand. And so what we're going to do is first, I'm just going to let you listen to this quick clip of a song that's on the radio now. Just going to do this the easy way and exit out, sort of screen sharing everything. And so you're seeing the lyrics here right now, and so that should be pretty obvious what the words to the song are, especially if you know the song. It's Thank You Next. But perhaps we prime you with some different information before you start hearing it. So I'm going to play the song again, and then I'm going to have you look at a different picture and see what you perceive the words to be. And so this is what some people refer to as the bacon egg song. And so you may not know what the words are saying, and this is pretty common when you're listening to a song on the radio. You come up with your own words, and oftentimes they're incorrect. But if I prime you with specific information, activate that information in your working memory, it will strongly influence what you end up perceiving. So if I show people a picture of bacon eggs while they're listening to this song, oftentimes they'll hear bacon eggs instead of Thank You Next. And so this is a more modern version that's using auditory information of the really classical experiments that we usually look at when we're priming attention or perception. And so the classical cognitive psychology experiments would typically, they would separate people into groups, and they would give them an ambiguous picture, okay? So let's say this is the ambiguous picture up here. One group, before they saw this picture, would either be shown a young boy, or perhaps a winter scene, whereas the other group, before they saw the picture, might see peacock feathers or a tomahawk. And so after they're presented with whatever their condition is, they're then presented with this ambiguous picture and they're asked to make a judgment about what the picture is. Now, more times than not, it's very reliable that people that are primed with information that's relevant to an Eskimo, we'll see an Eskimo here, kind of from the back. He's wearing like, you know, a big puffy Eskimo jacket. However, for people that are primed with the information that's related to an Indian, like peacock feathers or a tomahawk, they will report seeing that the picture is an Indian. And so by activating certain information in working memory, you influence how your perception interprets this information. The same thing for this ambiguous picture here. So some people are given words on a page, so they get used to reading words, whereas the other group would be given things that are associated, say, with a face, say eyeglasses or a businessman. And so more times than not, people that are primed with words on a page see liar in this ambiguous image because they're primed to read letters, whereas people that are shown things that have to do with a face typically report seeing a face since they were primed with that. And so these are very reliable findings in experiments, and they really show how powerful not only contextual sensory information is, but any information that we prime in your working memory. And you could imagine how often advertisers use this type of information. They're essentially priming what we should pay attention to, and that priming can be very, very powerful for more ambiguous information. And so both these experiments and that Thank You Next are great examples of that. The priming that you read in your textbook has to do more with memory. And so now we're going to take a step and look at some of this memory priming that they were talking about. They use the example of a cued word task, and we're not going to do that task here, but we will talk about it in some more detail and do a different task that's more interesting, really. So the idea of memory priming is that I can affect not only what information you pay attention to, but I can affect the information that you recall when asked by priming you with other related information. And so the best way to think of this, to not overcomplicate it, is that priming your memory is essentially reminding you of something, okay? So I reminded you of something, and so it's much easier to recall and remember that. And so we're looking at this part of the information processing process right now. But to really understand how this memory priming works, we have to talk about the network models and spreading activation that were mentioned in the text. And reading about these network models can honestly be a little overwhelming at times. And so we're going to simplify it here and show you exactly what we mean by spreading activation and how this leads to essentially reminding people of something, which will result in priming effects on memory. And so let's say that I have activated the word fire or the concept fire in your working memory, which I'm actually doing right now because I'm showing you the word fire. Now, in your long-term memory, we think that information is organized through like connected neurons or through synapses and connections that are made, but it ends up looking like a but it ends up manifesting as a network of related items. And so everything in your long-term memory is connected to other related information. And so what is the first thing you think of when I say fire? What's the first thing that comes to mind? Well, the first things that came to mind are likely the related information in your working memory that's connected to fire. So in my working memory, the first thing that, in my long-term memory, the first thing that came up when I thought of fire was fireplace, fire hydrant, fire truck, fire heat, just gives off heat, firewood, and fire festival, because I just watched this terrible documentary on the fire festival. And so the idea is that all of these things are connected in my memory. And so what happens when I activate fire in your working memory is that activation spreads to the other related information in your working memory, and thus brings that information into your working memory and has it available for processing and thinking. So when I say fire, it reminds you of wood. When or you probably have some other things that you wrote down that were associated with fire. So this idea of spreading activation is a lot like bleeding in clothing, okay? You might have some ink on one spot of the clothing, and then it'll continue to bleed and go outward, and so your activation may continue to spread all throughout your network. They refer it to as nodes, but essentially you can just think of it as information that is connected together, and when you activate one, it'll spread like fire to related ones, but eventually it'll lose steam and it will stop spreading. And so that diagram I made is a very simplified version of what the semantic information and knowledge in your long-term memory probably looks like. But really, it's going to be some crazy mess that looks more like this, but you can just see how certain things are connected together. Just randomly got this off the internet. And then this is a computer network model, which works in very much the same way. And so everything that's connected is essentially connected with a line together, which allows for activation to spread. And so how does this show priming? What does this have to do anything with memory? Well, for the cued recall tasks, if you couldn't remember something, and I said, it starts with an M, priming that information would then spread to other related things. So it would essentially activate all the things in your long-term memory that start with an M, and then you have that information available in your working memory. And so this helps. So we're going to do a little word list activity here, and this will help illustrate priming of memory, and it'll also help to connect to some of the concepts that we'll be learning about next week. And so what's going to happen is you're going to be presented with words from a list, one at a time, right here on the activity. I want you to remember the words, but of course, don't write them down. It defeats the purpose of the activity. Then after we've shown you all the words, the Ed Puzzle will give you a place to recall all the ones that you can remember. So I want you to get ready. I'm going to start presenting the words, and again, don't write them down yet. Okay, so whatever you wrote down on the Ed Puzzle, these are the list words, and you may have noticed that when you were trying to remember the list words as they were being presented to you, that they were all very similar, okay? So all of these words are related, which can make them easier to remember because we've essentially they're all priming each other. But the interesting part of this example is, do you remember recalling chair? So chair was not actually on the list, but more times than not, people will write down chair and remember having seen it. And that is because all of the list words that you did see, their activation spread. And since all of them are probably connected, or most of them are probably connected to chair in your semantic memory or your memory network, there was a lot of spreading activation that likely went to chair. And remember, when that activation spreads, what it does is it pulls that information into your working memory so that you can use it. So it actually activated the word chair in your working memory, even though you didn't see it. And so perhaps you wrote down or in the Ed Puzzle the word chair, or at the very least, you thought of the word chair. And so this is an example of priming. I can remind you of something by just showing you related things. And this is also an example of a false memory. Since if you remembered seeing the word chair, it wasn't ever on the list. And so you're remembering something that wasn't actually there. We'll get into false memories and some more of those implications next week. But let's revisit and go back to priming. And so We can prime your perception of things and literally how your brain makes you see or hear the world. We can prime what you pay attention to or what you remember by presenting you with information. We can also, your prior knowledge is priming you all the time and telling you what to fill in with any blanks in perception or what's important to pay attention to. And so priming really affects all the ways that we interact with the world. And so your perception and your memory and your attention can all be primed by your previous experiences. So you're more likely to perceive what you expect to perceive, as was in that budding example with that gift, your expectations, your beliefs. And so if you remember back to last week when we saw that picture of Jesus in the toast, a lot of people perceive Jesus' face in that toast, and that has to do because of their prior knowledge and their beliefs. Your attitudes and your semantic knowledge also have an incredible amount of influence on your memory and your perception. And so your semantic knowledge was illustrated in that activity just prior when we related all of those, when we activated all those semantically related words and actually had you remember a word that wasn't even there. So that's an example of priming. So I'd like you to think long and hard about how priming might be affecting your everyday life, affecting how you perceive the world, or affecting what information you pay attention to, or affecting what information you remember. And so things like implicit biases or the effects of stereotypes and attitudes is a good example of priming. Confirmation bias is a good example of priming. So confirmation bias would be when you are more likely to pay attention to, believe, and remember information that aligns with your prior knowledge and what you already think. And even things like persistent negative affect are due to priming, which we see in depression. And so depressed individuals, they usually have a lot of negative knowledge and information activated in their working memory at any given time. And so what that means is that they pay attention to other negative information more often. And so not only are they activating that information, but they're being primed by it and paying attention to other information. So it's just really coloring their entire experience and perception of the world. So we'll get into all of those more complex real world examples of priming later on in the coming weeks. But for right now, I'd like you to think before we end this activity of multiple ways and at multiple levels, if possible, of how priming might be coloring your perception of the world, your memory, and your attention.